in on there though, but I tried. Okay, so we are starting into lesson 4.6 today. Even if we got started right at the beginning of class, I knew we weren't going to get lesson 4.6 done. There's just a lot to it. So, if you backtrack, lesson 4.5 was solving quadratic equations using our factoring techniques, right? Okay, so we still need factoring techniques. And factoring is always my number one go-to method when I'm trying to solve. We're going to now start learning some other methods, okay? Lesson 4.6 is something called completing the square. Now, actually completing the square is down more at the bottom of the front page is when we'll start talking about that. We're going to kind of do some lead-in before we actually start completing the square. But again, these are other ways to solve here. As we look at example 1, you'll notice the heading. It says solving by using square roots. And as you start looking at these examples, what's different between these examples and most of the ones you were seeing in the previous homework? Okay, well, they don't equal 0 yet, but we'll get them if we can make them equal 0 if we need to. What'd you say? Or someone over here?
B doesn't have an X.
Okay. Do we have just a plain X term?
No.
No. In all of those, there are one or more, I guess just one X squared term, right? And then there are plain numbers, which plain numbers fall into the C category. Okay, they're constants. Do we have any BXs? No. Okay. In my opinion, that makes these problems easier to solve. If your only variables are the X squareds, that makes them easier to solve. Because now what we can treat this more like is more like solving just a regular linear equation. Normally, if it's just X's and numbers, I say work to get the X by itself, right? Well, here on example A, I'm going to say work to get the X squared term by itself. Because my goal is to make it X squared equals. So, as we look at A, if it's 4X squared plus 10 equals 36. How do we work to get that X squared term by itself?
Subtract 10.
Okay, if it's 4X squared plus 10, we're going to subtract 10. So once we subtract 10 here, 4X squared, 10 minus 10 cancels, 36 minus 10?
26.
How far are you guys? Can I change something real quick?
Yeah.
Sure.
I said I'm only as far as you are.
What does that mean?
This 36, to make this problem work right, especially as a first example, make your 36 a 46 there.
No,
Actually it's 4x squared equals 30.
Oh,
Okay. Sorry, I didn't look very closely at my notes. There's a typo in the notes, and I started doing the math, and I'm like, why are we dealing with 26? I don't want to deal with 26. That's not good. That's going to make this an ugly problem. I don't want ugly on our very first problem.
You
Okay?
made me think I subtracted 10 wrong, and I'm like, how did I do that?
Okay.
I'm like checking the notes. I was like, what?
Did my
Okay.
brain not come?
It's the teacher brain in me, okay? I know as my first example, I'm not going to have a number that's not going to work nicely for me. Maybe later on I will, but not in my very first example. So, okay. So pretend this problem really said 4x squared plus 10 equals 46. Still trying to get that x squared term by itself. If it's plus 10, we subtract 10 over, and 46 minus 10 is 36. Okay. Is x squared by itself?
No.
Getting there. We have the 4x, we have the x squared term by itself, but how do you get x squared totally by itself? Okay, if it's 4 times x squared, we're going to divide by 4. If we divide the left by 4, dividing the right by 4, 4x squared divided by 4, x squared. 36 divided by 4, 9. Okay, we're almost there. The deal is, guys, though, we're not solving for x squared. We're solving for x. How do we find x when we have x squared?
Square root.
Okay. Our step is to take the square root. If you take the square root of x squared on the left, you have to take the square root of x, or square root on the right. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 9 is 3. And
And 0.
negative 3. Okay, guys, there's the trick. Okay, keep in mind as we solve these x squared equations, majority of the time there are 2 answers. You've got to get in that habit in this chapter. Okay, when we were factoring, there were usually 2 answers, right? When we are solving using square roots, here's the deal. When you take the square root, okay, the square root of 9 says what number times itself, right? 3 times 3 is 9. Now, I said what other number because when you're solving an equation, you have to include both roots. What do you know about negative 3 times negative 3? It's also positive 9. And so my solutions are positive 3 and negative 3. You could also, I ran out of room there, I will on the next one. You could also write that as plus or minus 3. And there is that symbol in Math Excel where you could do it as plus or minus 3. I'll just put it off to the side because I ran out of room there. Okay, so once you find that symbol in Math Excel, you can use it. Do you have to use it? I don't think so. I think you could type 3 comma negative 3. I think Math Excel will be flexible with you. If not, you'll figure it out, right? I mean, I try and give you guys tips on Math Excel when I can, but ultimately it comes down to you guys have to figure out exactly what they want. So,
Is it going to be picky?
yeah. Okay. How do we feel about that? Should be too. As I said, I like these. These are easier than the factoring ones. They're easier than completing the square we're going to do later. I like these. So, okay. Now, in terms of, if you will, what was our first step that we are trying to do there? If I try and give you a couple of steps.
Subtract.
You're trying to get rid of your
We subtracted the 10 over. What was our goal here? We were trying to get
X by itself.
Okay, so I'm going to say we were trying to isolate, is the word I'm going to use.
Isolate.
We're trying to isolate the x squared term. Does that vocabulary make sense there? So we were trying to get the x squared term by itself. After we got the x squared term by itself, what did we then have to do to solve?
Yeah, the square root.
We took the square root. And so my step 2 is to square root. And you might want to write square root both sides if you want, but, you know, as long as you know what it means when you see square root. Okay, let's try example B. Example B we are using as written, just FYI there. Okay, 3x squared minus 5 equals 25. Okay, if we're trying to isolate x squared, if it's 3x squared minus 5, we first need to add the 5 over. So then, minus 5, so we add 5. Minus 5 plus 5 cancel. What's 25 plus 5? 30. Is x squared fully isolated?
No.
Okay, it's getting there. How do we separate the 3 and the x squared? Yeah, it's 3 times x squared. So we're going to divide by 3. 3x squared divided by 3 is x squared. What's 30 divided by 3? 10. Once you get x squared by itself,
You square root it.
our next step is to square root. If we're trying to square root x squared, we also have to square root 10. Square root of x squared is x. What's the square root of 10?
3.16.
Okay. What is the exact square root of 10?
3.6.
No, that's an approximate.
There's
What is the exact square root of 10?
3.16227766.
Square root of 10.
Oh.
Okay, so when you give me these rounded decimals, even if you give me every decimal on your calculator, it's still rounded because that's an irrational number. Your calculator is rounding that because it goes past the end of your calculator screen. Okay, I'm getting there. Nope, you're good. So the square root of 10 is this positive square root of 10 and the negative square root of 10, which I'm going to write this as plus or minus the square root of 10. Now, if you would prefer to write positive square root of 10, comma, negative square root of 10, that works as well. Okay. As I said, I like these. These are nice. So, yes.
On Math Excel, well, how will we have to put that in?
In terms of like, you can put it as a plus or minus. You should be able to. Or you could. My guess is it will let you do either or. It'll let you do plus or minus, or it'll let you do square root of 10, comma, negative square root of 10.
Okay.
But on that, they definitely aren't going to want 3 point whatever you guys were giving me. Okay? They aren't going to want that. They want an exact answer. So they're going to want square root of whatever. Unless, of course, like the last one, square root of 9. Don't leave it as square root of 9, right? Math Excel counts wrong there, but. Okay. You got the next one then?
Yeah.
7x squared minus 10 equals 25. So in order to get that x squared by itself, if it's 7x squared minus 10, we're going to add 10. Seven x squared equals 35. 7x squared, we have x squared, but it's not by itself. So 7 times x squared, divide by 7. 35 divided by 7 is 5. Do I stop there? No.
Square root is like.
I want to know what x is. So we're going to square root. What is the square root of 5?
Square root of 5.
Square root of 5, right? Your calculator's going to tell you 2 point something. Okay. But
2.2.
we just want to say square root of 5. So what is my answer here?
X equals plus or minus square root of.
Yeah, plus or minus the square root of 5. Okay, one more. You're pros at this, right? If it's 2x squared plus 9 equals 13. Okay, move the plus 9, I am subtracting 9. 2x squared equals 4. 2 times x squared, so we're going to divide by 2. 2x squared divided by 2 is 2. 4 divided by 2? 2. Tough math there, right?
X equals square root of 2 plus or minus square root of 2.
Okay. Since it says x squared equal, take that final step and take the square root. So I'm going to say plus or minus square root of 2. The hardest part of this might be remembering to do plus or minus. I mean, you know, when you get your first one wrong and you can't figure out why, try throwing a plus or minus
No,
in.
I keep wanting to skip ahead instead of like dividing it by the x. I keep wanting to like go straight to square.
Go square root. And you could to an extent, but it would make it harder.
Yeah, no.
It wouldn't be.
Why. I just keep wanting to like go straight
Yeah.
to the square root.
Okay. So we're kind of baby steps building to completing the square here. That's just solving using square roots. That once you have perfect squares or an x squared that's a perfect square on one side, we can take the square root of both sides. Now, example 2 here is solving a perfect square trinomial equation. And again, this is leading us to completing the square. What are the solutions of the quadratic equation? X squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 25. Now, I'm going to go against what you guys are going to tell me you want to do. And it's not that you couldn't, but I'm trying to show you a skill here, okay? So I'm guessing, based on our last lesson, you're wanting to go ahead and try and make this equation equal to 0 so that we can factor with product and sum. And it's not that you couldn't do that. But again, there's a skill I'm trying to teach or
Show you.
teach.
Show you.
I don't know, I'm tongue-tied. Now, with that in mind, what we are going to do, and it's because I know that both sides are perfect squares right now, believe it or not, both sides are perfect squares, we're going to factor that left side as is. Now, I can show you the shortcut here in a moment, but if we go back to how you guys have been factoring, so how we factored the last lesson. So let's look at just the left side. Can you factor x squared plus 4x plus 4?
Yes.
I would like to think so, right? X squared plus 4x plus 4, it looks like it's a good setup to factor into two parentheses. Because what do you know about x squared? When we have this trinomial like here, x squared breaks into x times x. What do you know about the numbers there? Okay. We need numbers that multiply to be 4 and add to be 4.
2.
Okay? If it multiplies to be positive 4 and adds to be positive 4, they're both positives, right? Now, I told you guys this is a perfect square trinomial, yes? It's a perfect square trinomial because it factored into x plus 2 quantity squared. Okay? And that's the whole point of, why we're doing this. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take that. Okay, that was just kind of my side work to get us started. X squared plus 4x plus 4. Can you agree that that can be rewritten as x plus 2 quantity squared? Based on the factoring I just did, right? X squared plus 4x plus 4 can be rewritten as x plus 2 quantity squared, still equaling 25. Well, we don't want to get x by itself yet here. Okay, what we have happening at this point, it looks different, but we're going to treat this like we did the section above. The section above, once we got the x squared term by itself, we took the square root of both sides. Okay, well, I don't have x squared, an x squared term per se, but I have x plus or minus a number, in this case x plus 2 quantity squared. So we have a perfect square on the left because it's x plus 2 times x plus 2. Something times itself is a perfect square. So like up above, we're going to take the square root and see what happens. So if I take the square root of the left side of the equation, we're going to take the square root of the right, correct? Old news there. Now, what is the square root of x plus 2 squared?
X plus 2.
Remember, when you take the square root of something squared, it's just whatever that piece is squared. So the square root of x plus 2 squared is x plus 2. What's the square root of 25? And? I'm going to write it as plus or minus 5. There's the trick. You can't forget the plus or minus there. Because if you forget the plus or minus, you've just lost an answer. And now, what are you thinking?
Minus 2.
Okay, if it's x plus 2, in order to get x by itself, we're going to have to subtract 2. Now,
You have to make 2 equations.
okay, yeah, it depends on where you're at in your brain here. Some of you are just going to subtract 2 here. Realize you have to do you have to subtract 2 from 2 different numbers, yes? Now, the visual, to make sure I've got everyone with me, is really what we're doing is we're doing x plus 2 equals positive 5, and x plus 2 equals negative 5. So you may or may not need that visual there, but there's two equations we're solving. In both equations, since it's x plus 2, we're going to subtract 2. So on the first one, 5 minus 2 is 3. On the next one,
-7.
can I write that in there? X equals 3. Negative 5 minus 2 is negative 7. So my solutions are x equals 3 and negative 7.
So it's just like yesterday's. You get it twice like yesterday's.
Yeah, except you're never doing the equal 0 here. And again, we did this because x squared plus 4x plus 4 is a perfect square itself. That's why we're doing this. Okay? Now, some of you might have just left it of x plus 2 equals plus or minus 5, subtracted your 2 there, and came up with your 2 answers. I'm fine with that. Okay, it's whatever, some of you aren't going to like that, so you'd rather write it out as 2. You pick your placement there. Before I move on, I'm going to write a couple of steps over here. I don't know, I'm all about steps today. Can you handle steps? Okay. What was the first step I did here? Is that I took that left side and I factored. So my first step here was that I factored the left. After I factored the left, okay, we square rooted not just one side, but both sides. So I'm going to write here that I square root both sides. And then, one last step. We basically, after we square root both sides, we had to solve for x. Obviously, I'm not giving you every little step there, but that's the basics. You factor the left. You square root both sides because that left should turn into a perfect square. And then we solve for x. And again, this leads us into completing the squares, what it's leading us into. Questions there? Okay, let's try the other one here. Where the solutions of the quadratic equation x squared minus 14x plus 49 equals 25. Okay. If it was yesterday, I'd say, okay, let's make it equal to 0, go from there. But, specifically, we're talking about perfect squares here, right? I'm doing the side work over here. You may or may not need this side work. Maybe you can just factor it. You've already got it. How do we factor x squared minus 14x plus 49?
Well, they're all square root. They're all in the greatest common factor. No, they don't.
Almost. You want them to, but. X squared breaks into x and x. What do you know about 49?
7.
The square root of 49 is 7, right? And guess what? Square root of 49 is 7, and 7 plus 7 is 14. Now, how do I get this to make negative 14?
Negative something negative.
You need both numbers negative, right?
The easiest math.
Okay. So, how can x minus 7 times x minus 7 be written? Okay. So, x minus 7 squared.
It's so easy to forget this one, right?
Again, you guys will learn the hard way at Math Excel when you get some wrong after only putting one answer. You know, I'm going to remind you as much as I can, but okay. You guys okay with the fact that I rewrote this as x minus 7 squared equals 25? We factored the left. So that was step 1. The next step is to square root both sides. We've got perfect squares happening, so I'm going to square root both sides. What is the square root of x minus 7 squared?
X minus 7.
X minus 7. Good. I want you guys able to answer that. That should be an easy answer once you get used to it. Square root of 25? 5 and negative 5. After you square root both sides, we're going to... Okay. Somehow or another you're solving for x, right?
Yeah.
Some of you are just jumping right in and doing your math right here. Some of you are saying, I think I would prefer to set up 2, right? X minus 7 equals 5. X minus 7 equals negative 5. As a math person, I would just jump right in and add 7 right there to both numbers, write down 2 answers. But that's me with the experience, so. Okay, what answers did you get?
X equals
12.
Okay, we added 7. So 5 plus 7 is 12. And negative 5 plus 7 is 2. So we have solutions of 12 and 2. What do you think? Is it going to matter what order I write my solutions?
No.
Nope. Doesn't even matter to Math Excel.
Wow.
What?
Crazy thought, isn't it?
I know, right?
On occasion, Math Excel is flexible about things. On occasion.
Really? If you get lucky.
Okay, questions here. Okay. I'm going to look at the next part. I'm kind of debating how we're going to get caught here. Now, I will say there's a typo up there. I wonder. Let's see. Try to see. I wasn't sure if it'd work or not. Okay. So, what you have here are some completing the square steps. Okay? I'm so good you can't even tell what I did. Step 1 is what I changed. It says rewrite the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. That does not say equals c in your notes. It says plus c in your notes. So that is going to be when we get into doing one of these, and it'll have to be tomorrow. But our first job is going to make sure that it's basically x squared and x on one side, numbers on the other side, so constants on the other side. So like in this example right here, x squared minus 6x minus 10. They kept x squared and minus 6 together, and what happened with the minus 10? Added it to the other side. So that will be our first step. Now, it is important to point out that right there when it says x squared, that specifically is going to be a 1x squared. Notice there is no a in front of it, which means there cannot be any value in front of that other than 1. Okay? Step 2 will be the important step that we'll talk about, and that will be to complete the square by adding b over 2 squared to each side of the equation. Now, when we do this, I'll set up a little bit differently because this, I know, looks confusing. But what we'll be doing is we'll be finding b. Where do we find b?
X.
It's the number in front of x, right? So like in this case, b is negative 6. So we'll take negative 6, we'll divide it by 2, and then we'll square it. So negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. Negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. So what we would be doing is we would add 9 to both sides of the equation, which is essentially what's happening right there. That's really 9. And we'll write it as 9 because you guys will be much happier with that. Then, we're going to jump into what we just did at the previous problem. Factor the left side. Wasn't I having you factor the left side earlier?
Yeah.
And think about it. If this is x squared minus 6x plus 9, well, can't we do square roots again? The square root of 9 is 3, and 3 plus 3 is 6. So this will factor into x minus 3 squared. So we're factoring a perfect square trinomial. After we factor, we will, step 4, square root both sides. Notice the square root of 19 is plus or minus the square root of 19. And then we'll solve for x. So those 3 steps I mentioned earlier are steps 3, 4, and 5 on what we're doing tomorrow. Okay? So we will pick up and do a completing the square problem tomorrow. We have a couple, and then we'll also practice putting things into vertex form. Okay? You can probably look at lesson 4.6 a little bit, but there's not going to be a whole lot that you're going to be, you can do, there's a handful you can do, but not a bunch.
Dylan,
Okay?
did you notice the food thing before and stand?